Contrasting shape. This is fun. This is Chagall. And a great Chagall it is, too. Because look at how angular all the houses are. The shape of the coat. I just adore the coat. All those angular shapes, and then the violin, which is so curved. And it is the focal point because it is so different from all of the other geometric, sort of obviously squared and rectangled and triangled shapes around the figure. He has a few curves to him. He's got a curve in his hat. He's got a curve in the Tower of the Bell there on the right. He's got a curve in his elbow, but nothing dominates the way the curve of that violin does against. And colors play a pretty important role here also, as it would with any of these masters. It's not a one-trick pony. All these elements are working together, and that's what's so exciting, because that's what you can do too. Paul Gauguin, love this because it's a more subtle approach to variations in shape. They're the curves of the horses and the curves of the human body. But I think, at least for me, the focal point, and I went round and round about this one too. Half the time I think the focal point is the young woman who is without the horse. Sometimes I think the focal point is the guy on the horse off to the right, because in a sense he's isolated. And perhaps this is again the Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks dilemma. They're equally important in the painting. If you took out either one, it wouldn't be as strong as it is. And so that's one of the things we're analyzing. In addition, may I point out, to the gorgeous horizon line in that deep, deep blue, which is really only countered by the orange on the saddle of the horse there on the right, and then the beautiful pinks and orangey pinks, salmony pinks that are in this ground on the landscape, and how those balance the beautiful blues and blue-grays that are in the sky. Oh boy, and this is a great one. So here we've got, again, contrasting shape. Another early Paul Klee, 1928. And all those formed, a lot of color happening here, but you know, it's all about the contrast of the form. So we've got the triangles, we've got the rectangles, we've got, I'm not sure, is there anything that borders on being square? And then really the Meryl Streep of this production is the orange sort of globe there floating in empty space. And this would also, I suppose, be a valid example of an element that's isolated from the rest of the elements, and the isolation in itself creates the focal point. So several fantastic things going on here at once. Now how about similar elements contrasted with a larger, smaller, brighter version of the element? I wrote that and I thought, well, that's, you know, pretty good explanation, but let's look at some examples and see how far we can blow that all open. So here we've got a wonderful quilt by Sue Benner, and of course, well, this series was called Nest, and of course you can see how all of the circles, even the imperfect circles, and remember we had that Edward, I think it was Edward Hopper painting last time, all those people sitting in deck chairs looking off to the right. The fact that the picture was not complete because some of the elements were actually out of the picture range. Well, actually, it was the focal point that was out of the picture range. And go back and look at that with a new eye to seeing that that could be true. But what we have here is another variation on that particular theme. If you look 2 blocks over and 1 block down, that bright, bright orange spiral against the yellow, that's the focal point. It's a very complex surface and put together in squares. And, you know, really, how masterful is this to create this composition, which I believe, having seen this piece, is about 50 inches wide and 44 or so in length. But in any event, the change in value that you see there, this wonderful movement that's been created by the lines, all of that feeds into that center. And so you've got little circles and bigger circles and concentric circles, and all of those circles focus back on that gorgeous, odd little center. We've got Lisa Call, and we looked at this last week, I think, also, and I just thought I'd throw it in again because, of course, this is a series of sizes of the houses, and they're not exactly the same, but we do, I think, recognize that the large greenhouse on the left is certainly dominating everything else, and that in fact it's almost like a path from the left-hand corner up through and around. It could create a spiral, and that's a really beautiful way that she has pulled it together. I wasn't sure where to put this painting of Georgia O'Keeffe's, and yet I loved it so much I wanted to include it. And then I realized it was the same, it was similar shapes, but instead of working only with a small shape or a large shape being dominant, what we're working with here is this absolutely white shape. This is a building scape painted before she got out to New Mexico and really started to look at form and expand her vision. And so we have this wonderful, I just think, isn't it great? Not only the white building that's obviously illuminated by the lights beyond the two darker buildings, but also, really, for you, tell me, I'd love to know. I think the focal point is that beautiful orb that is either the moon rising right near the horizon in the picture. And then I didn't notice until I'd been looking at it a while that there's a very small star in the top third of the composition, and what sensitivity it takes to build those elements into the painting. Hey, how about contrasting abstract elements with one or more recognized elements? You know, we're all over the place here, and it all works. And it works because eventually we get our handles on all of the various strategies that we have in order to manipulate this part of the composition or that part of the composition. But, and of course, that's where we're headed in week 4 and 5. Right now, let's look at the fact that if you took the boat out of the composition, it still feels very abstract. But we've got a little branch, and we've got what we recognize because we have context. We can see the boat in the context of the other sort of grassiness on the left. And that helps tell a story in a very loose, beautiful way, because what it means is that we can see the abstraction, but we can also, and then we can riff on that in kind of a poetic way, but we can also, we're grounded by the boat and the figure, so we know this is a scene that has something to do with reality. Now, I talked last week about stylistic combinations and how something could be relatively abstract or textural and still have a realistic component, and how supportive those two things can be of each other. And so I wanted to bring back another Mary Cassatt just because I want to be sure to include enough women in a presentation like this. You know, you go online and you're looking at men, or I look at the library of files that I have, and I love all those painters, but I don't want to fall short on the end of representing work that women have done. And so we're back to Mary Cassatt with this, and what I love about this particular painting is that it's such a great example of how there can be abstracted elements. And, you know, from the surface design perspective, this is definitely true. Textures I print into the background, loose imagery, hand painting, color field stuff, dye work that's just rather amorphous. All of that creates a background upon which we can establish a more recognizable, and in this case, very representational image. It's the best of both worlds. And then you reverse that, you know, flip it, and you've got an abstracted element juxtaposed with representational elements. So in this case, we have a David Hockney painting, and it was from the era when they were very structural, architectural, based in Southern California. You've got that blue Southern California sky. Look at that darker blue value in the swimming pool. And then you have this amazing element that is just really very abstract, that represents, in the best possible way, the water after somebody has jumped. So, lots to be learned from looking at that combination. Now let's talk about the isolation of one element as a way of creating the focal point. And I took the liberty of putting up a piece of mine, a favorite. This is the Judge from my Archetype series. And the Kingfisher, there's a lot going on here, but because the background is fairly low key and because the design elements are smaller, the Kingfisher, as the recognizable element, being set off to the side this way, definitely commands the field. Same thing true in this Gauguin painting, but from a slightly different standpoint. We've got a lot of figures here, and they're all human, but we certainly see where the difference is being called out. And so she is in isolation in more ways than one, I would hazard a guess. Looks of sadness on their faces, or is it admiration? That's part of the beautiful thing of being able to tell the story. And a photograph. In this case, the young Gaul and parent, I assume, off to the right, isolated from the reflections of the people who are walking by, and definitely the focal point of the composition. I think the last variation that we're visiting today is the central placement, which of course we studied before as radial composition. And so these are radial versions and also directional approaches. And another beautiful Georgia O'Keeffe painting. In this case, we know, if we know about her, that the beige structure was a bone, and that she, numerous times in her career, chose that orientation, and that would be a wonderful thing to analyze. Short version, looking through the mirror of earthly ties into the universe beyond. But perhaps it was all about the color and the form for her. In any event, this is a wonderful composition. It's radial, but it isn't like a mandala. And perhaps in its own way it has more power because it's not a mandala. But we certainly see the beautiful orb of the moon, or possibly the sun. I like to think that's the moon, the way you sometimes see it in daylight. Nice piece by Linda McLaughlin, quilted piece that references the swoops and swirls and circles painted by Tibetan monks, and the expressiveness of that and the being in the moment part of that. And certainly in a piece like this, which I think you can see the quilting, painting that circle was the simple part, in a sense. It's all of the support, the quilting and the layering and putting it together to create and validate the simplicity of it that is its strength. Love this piece by my friend Alison Whittemore. It was in a Quilt National, and it's also been, I think, in Form and Function. And it's called Funny Looking Kid. And it's another riff on putting the focal point right in the middle and making it all, which is probably true of portraits in a general sense. You know, it's all about the figure being portrayed. And here it looks as though she's drawn it on graph paper to get it right, but all those lines are quilted. In any event, another nice riff on the central location. We'll finish up with a few of additional paintings where we don't have the focal point in quite the same way. It's not obviously centered, but once you start analyzing and teasing it apart, you can see that it's true. So here's another Chagall, and we've got the ring, so that's a clue. We've got the whiteness of the horse, that's a clue. We've got the size of the dancer or the acrobat and the horse, that's a clue. And we've got her shape. All those things are clues to the fact that she is central and most important to this performance. Another Gabriel Munther, and in this case, not quite so easy to decipher, and yet when you look at it, you can see that it's true. Here we have the red tree and the green trees around it, and then the cattle who are backed up into that grove, and all of the lines are pointing toward the tree. And so that's an example of radial balance, but not handled in the way of it being one single element in the center of the composition. In this case, we have lines that lead toward the middle and emphasize the fact that that red tree is the most important thing in the story. Another example of Georgia O'Keeffe's, here we have, again, the lines of the bones, the pelvis, directing your eye to the center, to the negative space, which is a very contemporary aspect of handling space. But you can see that obviously all of those, whether you're coming in from the top or you're coming in from the sides, the important thing is that oval that represents the hole in the bone. Repetition. Repetition's pretty great, and this is a good example of it. You know, it can be lots of things. It can be, and I keep going back to the presentation I did for number 2, and there was that beautiful picture of that grove of trees, and they were all straight up, and then there was a figure. That was a beautiful sense of repetition, but I didn't want to pull that picture out and use it again. I wanted to use something new. So this is Hundertwasser, and a wonderful, playful drawing of lines and shapes, and where do they lead? They're all repetitive, and they all lead to the center, which is, once again, in that 1/3 in, 1/3 up position, the only circle in the composition. Another Hundertwasser, much more obviously focused on the center. The colors, everything vibrates and directs your eye toward the center, as if it couldn't hold its own already. This is Renoir, and gosh, wonderful sense of repetition in the uprights of those trees. Although, you know, sometimes repetition supports a focal point more than it is the focal point, I would say, looking at this now, that the focal point quite possibly is the woman on the left in the blue. And maybe she's balanced by the darkest tree on the far right, and the repetition in between leads your eyes between the two. And if you have an opinion of that, I'd love to hear it. Another Hundertwasser, and repetition for sure here, and all of the faces, my take on it, lead from the right around to the full face on the left, which I believe, unless I study this more, is the focal point, or is it that eye dead center in the middle? In any event, this is the positive thing about studying it. Your eyes go back and forth, and you can question it. And you know what? There isn't any real right or wrong answer. There's only your response and your deeper understanding in that moment of time. So we close with absence of a focal point, and what better artist to select than Jackson Pollock? And I think it's a little bit of a cheat to say that he doesn't have a focal point, because when you go to the Jackson Pollock website and you start to look at his paintings, or if you have seen them in person, yes, it is an overall field of paint. But whether he intended it or not, just the motion of spewing and pouring and spraying the paint did create variation. And sometimes the variation created a focal point, whether he liked it or not. That would make an interesting study. So Helen Frankenthaler, color field, sort of glaze work. And you know, I've always thought, before I thought seriously in the process of developing this class, that color field painting was another example of painting that did not necessarily have a focal point. And yet, if you Google it or you go and look just at Helen Frankenthaler's work, there's an element there that draws your eye. Even with Rothko's paintings where the orange is meeting the blue, that line commands the stage. Wonderful quilt by Bernadette Kanai, and she uses this format, these tiny stitched together pieces, in everything that she produces. So I say more power to her for the tenacity required to produce this work. And although I added it because I felt it was a field sort of study without a focal point, when I started to look at it, I decided that there were actually several lime green, very faint green rectangles that take my eye right there. And so then the question becomes, how hard is it to avoid a focal point? And we close with this piece of mine, which was created, 1997, I think, made from interfacing and clear transparencies printed on a photocopier. And the goal was not to have a focal point. It's created in the style of a log cabin. So there's certainly red elements that move your eye across the surface, but I don't know that there's a place where your eye lands. And so I leave you with that question as you're working on your own pieces and as you're looking at other people's work and evaluating. How often do you look at a piece where there is actually not a place for your eye to land? That's how important the focal point is. And that's how hard it is for us to get away from creating it.